Good morning. Usually we sugar up after this service, so I'm watching you now. You know, as you probably know, this is the last Sunday of Stewardship Month. I think that's right, right? Okay. And because I try to be a responsible preacher, I spent several hours this week with the Google machine looking up the definition of Christian stewardship. I confess that I didn't find much of anything that was particularly edifying. For one thing, the stewardship comments I found were mostly about money, about how a good Christian should live within their means and stay out of debt and make good investments and take care of their family. And of course, give to the church. I was looking for something that didn't seem quite so much like a message from my credit union. Something a bit more theologically satisfying. I did find several websites that at least talked about remembering that everything we have comes from God, which is a good starting point, I think, and added that we are to be good managers of what God has given us all, which still seemed focused a bit too much on what we individually have. And then, almost without exception, these websites, I can't tell you how many times I saw this sentence, always use the same quotation, which is from the late R.C. Sproul, who was a very conservative minister. And the quote is, fundamentally, stewardship is about exercising our God-given dominion over his creation, and that we should reflect the image of our Creator God in his care, responsibility, maintenance, protection, and beautification of his creation. Now, I suppose I could make that sentence okay. It's just that it has the word dominion in it. To which my first response is that we might want to ask God's good creation about how that dominion stuff is working out for it. And my second response is dominion over God's creation really what stewardship is about? I mean, assuming we try to be nice dominionists. I have to let you know that our denomination does not seem to think so. I did look at the UCC website, and you know what? There's no mention of dominion anywhere on the stewardship page. In fact, it was the UCC's suggestion that on this last Stewardship Sunday, we focus on the passage from the prophet Micah and the story of the foot washing in the Gospel of John that you just heard, which are, I must tell you, rather unconventional choices. So I'm going to unpack those readings a bit. Let's start with John. Now, I was first startled by this choice because typically we only hear this scripture on Maundy, Thursday. And maybe it's because I was reading it outside the context of Lent. I did find myself seeing this story a bit differently, seeing it a bit more focused. We have no earthly idea about who exactly wrote the Gospel of John. But if we listen to all those little specifics that the story includes, Jesus doesn't have a towel, he has a linen towel, those kind of specifics, then it seems to me at least plausible that this story might have originally been told by someone who had been in that room, someone who had told the gospel writer or a whole series of people until it got to the gospel writer of this event. And they told this story because it was so burned in their memory, partly because it was just such an unusual event, but mostly because it was such an odd event that occurred on what turned out to be the last night of Jesus' life, the last time the disciples ate with him. On that night, they, of course, didn't know that Jesus would be dead in less than 24 hours. Oh, but afterwards, I'm sure this particular night played over and over and over in their minds. Now, on this night, Jesus and the disciples had the use of a small upper room for their meal. Kind of atypical because I suspect that most of their meals were eaten around campfires. But on this night, they got to eat in a warm room, reclining on cushions. Supper is brought to them, laid on the low table, and they begin to eat. And then it gets weird. All of a sudden, they're eating, for heaven's sakes. Jesus gets up and takes off his outer garment. He wraps a towel around his waist. He gets a basin. He pours water into it and kneels in front of each disciple and begins to wash each one's feet. You know, I think if we'd been there, if a camera could have captured it, we would have seen really startled disciples, you know, the bread halfway to their mouth, abruptly sitting up on their cushions with their mouths and their eyes wide open. What on earth is going on here? Now, there was nothing odd about foot washing. It just didn't usually happen in the middle of a meal. This was a culture where everyone wore sandals and everyone walked from place to place on dirt paths, so this was the land of perpetually dirty feet. The disciples had been invited into homes to eat, of course, and when they did, I am sure that basins of water were provided for them to wash their feet, and if the host was wealthy, a lowly servant was sent to wash their feet for them. But come on, tonight there is no host. It's just them. What's a few dirty feet among friends? And besides, too late, already eating. And beyond their surprise about what was going on, I suspect that there was quickly a sense of discomfort. Probably started this way. Maybe they were thinking that one of them should have arranged a basin of water for foot washing. Maybe Jesus is scolding them for that. They should have. Maybe someone had just forgotten. Maybe some of them, I'm sure this was true, were grumbling that it had been so-and-so's turn to arrange that. But the worst part, the nagging thought, surely one of them should have at least washed their master's feet. After all, just a few days before, they had been guests at a dinner at the home of Lazarus and Mary and Martha and Bethany, and they had watched as Mary had anointed Jesus' feet with a pound of precious perfumed ointment and then dried Jesus' feet with her hair. So yeah, they should have been respectful enough to wash their master's feet with water at least. Instead, here he was, half clothed, kneeling on the floor, washing their feet. You know, you got right down to it, it was kind of scandalous. They all knew that this was not how things were supposed to be, but as usual, it was Peter who said it out loud. "No, Master, you will not wash my feet." It upset every protocol of the ancient world. Masters do not wash the feet of their followers. And Peter was not having it. And then Jesus says something unexpected to Peter. "Unless I wash your feet, you have no share with me." In effect, Jesus says, "Peter, you can't be a part of my mission if you refuse." So Peter capitulates, but not before asking for a whole bath, because, you know, it's Peter. And then it's done. Jesus sets the basin and the towel aside. He gets up, puts on his robe, and rejoins them at dinner. I think it's very quiet around that table. And Jesus breaks the silence with the question, "Do you know what I have done to you?" And for once, they aren't stupid. They know that the correct answer is not, "You washed our feet?" No. Because they realized that this was about something so much bigger, a kind of last lesson for the disciples, though they didn't know it was the last one. As Jesus said to them, "You say I am your teacher, your master. If I can do this for you, then surely you can do this for each other." What Jesus had done to them was to show them how the reign of God on earth had to function. No one greater, no one lesser. God's reign on earth was not to be a hierarchy of power, not a system of control over others. It was not to be anybody's dominion over anyone or anything else. This new way that Jesus was inaugurating had to be a community of servant leadership. Everyone a servant and everyone a beneficiary of that grace. It must be that kind of community so it could stand as a bulwark against a world that still practices, still demands exactly the opposite. Each of them must do for their brothers and sisters as God has done for them. And one more thing, that lesson that Peter was personally taught: no one can set themselves apart from the loving kindness of others either. No one can say, "Well, I'll wash your feet, but I refuse the vulnerability of you washing mine." No. We all must be each other's willing servants, and we all must be the grateful recipients of the loving kindness of others. That's the requirement for the reign of God. And what does this have to do with stewardship? How about everything? Yes, stewardship is about what the church needs in terms of economic support, but it is not first and foremost or primarily about money and managing monetary resource. Stewardship is above all about relationships. Our relationship to God, our relationship with each other, our relationship to all of creation. It is about the covenant of love that we make with God and each other. And if we fail in this model of stewardship, what does it look like when our stewardship is not about relationship? Well, as it turns out, every prophet in the First Testament can tell us exactly what it looks like. The prophet Micah leaves us with a message that is particularly timely for this Sunday. Micah was preaching in Judah, the southern kingdom, both before and after the fall of the northern kingdom. And his message was a familiar one, at least it's familiar for prophets. If the people refused to honor their covenant with God, then surely destruction would follow, just as it had in the north. But here's what I find so interesting about Micah. He points out that the rich of Judah were more than happy to fulfill their obligations to the temple. Does the temple want a herd of lambs for sacrifice? Sure. How about more grain and oil than you know what to do with? No problem. 6 oxen for sacrifice? Maybe a dozen. Happy to help out. Shoot, if you want my firstborn child, if the temple wants that for a sacrifice, that can be arranged. By the way, that idea was as abhorrent then as it is now. My point is that we could say that the wealthy of Judah made huge pledges to the temple, and they always fulfill those pledges. But Micah wanted them to recognize that they had completely failed in their stewardship. They failed because the only real relationship that they had was with their wealth, with their riches. Because they lied and cheated to make more money or grab more land. Because they were more than happy to exercise their brutal dominion over anyone beneath them. Because they completely ignored the poor, except when they were cheating them or selling them into slavery. Because they didn't care if the widows and the orphans and the disabled just died on the streets. Because they ignored the meaning of God's covenant with them. And so Micah asked the question, What does the Lord actually require of you? Not more of your ill-gotten gains. Your Lord requires that you do justice, that you love mercy, and that you walk humbly with your God. God's only demand is that you fulfill the covenant of love. That's the pledge that matters. And isn't that the pledge that should matter the most for all of us as well? When we act as the kind of stewards that God intends us to be, we come together as a community bound by the covenant of love. We bear each other's burdens. We share each other's joys. We pool our resources, not just our money, our individual talents, our individual visions of what it is possible for us as a community to do, so that we can, as a community of faith, do justice and demonstrate loving kindness. And always, always, we act as servants to and for each other and for the wider world in each and every way that we can reach out to it. That's our pledge. There's a hymn that's been running through my head all week long, and I so wish I could sing, so I could sing it to you from the pulpit, but I can't. So instead, on this last Sunday of stewardship, let me quote just a tiny bit of it. Hymn 539 starts with these simple phrases. Won't you let me be your servant? Let me be as Christ to you. And pray that I may have the grace to let you be my servant too. May it be so.